Oh, oh, okay. Please, and for the Pledge of Allegiance, Mr. Rothschild, would you do the honor, please?
Of course. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Oliver, do your thing. Roll call.
Yes, good evening. Committee Member Guerrero, absent. Committee Member Arceo, also absent. Um, Emilio Lopez, who's here,
Present.
present. Angela Torres,
Present.
Anthony Aguirre, Edward Wolbert,
Here.
Ed Neighbors, Richard Kaplan, Rafi Bell,
Present.
Joel Rothschild.
Present.
Seeing is no longer. We have a quorum. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Smell the ink. For public comments for items listed and not listed on the agenda with a 3-minute limit, is there anyone in the audience? Come forward. State your name, please.
My name is Juan Olmedo. I'm a representative of the Southwest Regional Council of Partners. Like always, my apologies.
We heard you, though.
You know, we're always interested in making sure that our local constituents hopefully get to work close to home and stuff. That's why we always input our you know, our talking points to this. So here we go. You know, we represent 5,800 members in San Bernardino County alone. I want to say, I believe it's 800 plus that live here in San Bernardino. So it is important for us to speak on this. We believe that this project will that they will be impacted by the environmental impacts of this project. The city should require the project to be built utilizing skilled and trained workforce. Local hire and skilled and trained workforce requirements reduce construction-related environmental impacts while benefiting the local economy. In a recent 2020 report titled Putting California on the High Road, a Jobs and Climate Action Plan for 2030, the California Workforce Development Board concluded that investments in growing, diversifying, and upscaling California workforce can positively affect returns on climate mitigation efforts. Moreover, just this year, the South Coast Air Quality Management District found that the use of a local state certified apprenticeship program or a skilled and trained workforce with a local hire component can result in air pollution reduction. Other cities have not hesitated to apply the skilled and trained workforce requirements for private developments projects in their city. Recently, the city of Hayward in Northern California adopted skilled and trained workforce requirements into its general plan and municipal codes. Local skilled and trained workforce requirements can boost economy, development, mitigate transportation and greenhouse impacts by minimizing vehicle mileage traveled. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, Yes, good evening, committee members. On tonight's agenda, we have a couple of items. Woody Tesher from PlaceWorks will provide us with a couple of updates on the project schedule and some of the public participation activities. And then we'll also have a presentation by Mark Hoffman with the team that's going to have a brief discussion, maybe brief, maybe not so brief, on the housing element that we're preparing. That's one of the elements of our general plan. And so we're continuing on that process, and he'll give you an update and an educational series on that item. And with that, Woody, please.
Thank you. I don't think we need to introduce ourselves anymore.
Okay.
We can have you introduce us, actually.
Okay, well
That'll
then,
work.
we know who you are now. Do you want to start with the project update?
Yes, I will move that on. Thank you. We, at our last meeting, distributed an updated schedule. That schedule is going to change a little bit again, but let me, for the next few weeks in particular, it'll change. Let me basically provide you the overview, update, et cetera. I've got the wrong slide up, the agenda slide. There we go. As you may know, we took the vision statement that you had worked on diligently and thoughtfully to the City Council last night. Along with also the vision statement for the downtown and the initial concepts for downtown and the development capacities of the downtown. And the City Council unanimously approved all that material, et cetera. So they're thankful to you for your diligent input to this as well. And it was a major step in the planning process as well. So we consider that to be a benchmark achievement of the planning process, et cetera. So as you know, we're in the process of updating the land use plan, and here's where a little bit of changes are going to be occurring. We just need to have a conversation about this because it will affect your schedule. Basically, we will not have our meeting in April, any meeting in April. So this will be our first meeting until May. So the two meetings that are on your agenda for April will not occur, and I'll explain why in a moment. We are right now, and I will be coming to this next item on the agenda, in a process, deep process of community workshops. We've completed 4 of the 7. A number of you have attended. Thank you very much. And one of you have actually volunteered to be a facilitator at a couple of our upcoming workshops as well. So thank Angela for that effort as well. Those workshops continue through next Saturday, a week from Saturday, March 26th. That'll be wrapped up also with a virtual workshop, so to basically replicate the activities that, and I'll be reviewing those in a moment, that we conduct at the in-person workshops, a little more simplified process than what we've been doing in person because it is a digital version of the exercise that we did in person. That workshop was scheduled for March 28th. It will be a live workshop. At the same time, and we'll, again, I keep saying, I will be explaining more here, is we also have the exercise live now that you can actually go home to the project website that we have, and you will see a link to the exercise that you can basically participate in the same exercise that we did in the live in-person workshops. That's active now. That will be active for, and the third bullet on here will be active to through April 14th. So a couple of weeks beyond the conclusion of our live in-person workshops and our virtual workshop on the 28th, the additional 2 weeks. We then, the city staff and consultant, are going to be digesting that information. We're getting a lot of great comments, a lot of great inputs. We'll be summarizing what we saw, what we heard. We will be meeting internally with city staff, the team, et cetera, and then be coming to you in your next meeting, which is one of the reasons we're assuming this is going to take us much of the month of April, especially if it's the final public input is closing the 14th. We're going to need another week or two to digest everything from the public, interpret it, et cetera, to bring back to you in a form that in your next meeting you you will be able to take a look at that, and then we'll be initiating the process for you to be making recommendations that we will ultimately be taking back later in the summer to the public at large as well. And we'll be talking about these meetings subsequently. But those are the major next activities for you, the advisory committee, to be considering. During this period of time, we'll be interspersing more conversations about the housing element as well. So it's not as if we'll be completely isolated during that period of time. But right now, there will be none of the two meetings that were on your schedule scheduled for April. It says May 15th. That's still to be determined depending upon our housing information as well. So the next GPAC meeting, at least addressing land use, you'll see up here on the screen, is May 19th. It was one of your scheduled meetings on the schedule that you had before, but that is confirmed. That's when we'll be bringing back to you what we heard from the public, and indeed begin the decision process in terms of recommendations for the specific sub-areas. And the end date's still the same, of going to a preferred plan by the end of August of this year. So it hasn't shifted the overall schedule as well. Any questions about the overall update? We'll be submitting you an updated overall master schedule very shortly. This is
Any comments? Any comments from any of the other candidates? Any other committee members?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the housing element. Can you just, what is that?
That's what this person over here is going to be talking about a little bit later on our agenda here.
Thank you.
So you'll save your question for them.
It will be answered.
I know that I attended the Second Ward land use, and it was interesting. It was quite interesting. It was well attended, and it was broken up into groups. Each had its own facilitator in English and in Spanish, and it was quite interesting to hear from the residents. It makes a difference when a lot more people attend these community outreach forums, and they were making good comments and so forth. So, you know, if any of you have attended or if you've yet to attend, I'd recommend it. Okay, and then I think you want to speak on the project.
On the workshops.
Public outreach?
Yeah, let me just share with
Before
you
we
what
get
we have
into the
been
land
doing
use.
at the workshops, and a little bit, I'll piggyback a little bit upon what our chair had indicated about the workshops and attendance and so forth. So as you see up here on the screen, we have completed 4 of those workshops. Overall, compared to our first round of workshops, we're doubling and tripling, and in one case, I think, quadrupling our attendance that we had in the first round. So the word is getting out. The City Council, any of you watched the City Council meeting last night, I feel sorry for you, but if anyone saw the City Council meeting last night, the City Council was very robust in basically advertising and encouraging people to attend the next series of workshops. And so we're very grateful to the council, who have taken very strong interest in this process as well, and in terms of basically calling folks and basically helping in the outreach process as well. As you see, the upcoming, what I said about saying it's sorry is how long it went last night. And you know, it's like council meetings can continue late into the evening as well. So the upcoming workshops, we have 3 remaining next week, next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday next week. The 2 evening workshops, as the other ones, are scheduled from 6 to 8 p.m. The Saturday workshop is scheduled from 10 to 12. Not that long, not to 10 to 4. And then, as I mentioned before, the citywide virtual meeting is on the 28th. Let me share with you what we're basically doing at the workshops for your education. And I think a couple of you did participate in them and sort of know what we did at these particular workshops. We basically have 2 exercises. The first is a perspective of the entire city. We have a map on the table that is a representation of all the existing land uses in the city. It also has the ward boundaries on that map. I'll show you that map in a moment. And what our basic objective is for the participants to give us their insights about those places that either exist today or have the potential of it becoming the key activity places in the city, where they would go, where they may go to shop, where they may go to be the places that they would identify. What's my neighborhood center? If I'm going to have a major gathering place in my neighborhood, where would that be? And so we're asking people to identify that, and you see bulleted text up there calling it uniquely identifiable places. So the one I think the most obvious we've heard so far, downtown, obviously that becomes one. But then we have had a number of ideas in different areas throughout the city, places such as, let's say, in the Vertimont area where there's no sense of some real major gathering place in Vertimont. We've had some ideas from some people there for a particular location or other locations, capitalizing upon the college or capitalizing upon Valley College as well, or other areas. We've heard a lot of people thinking about the baseball stadium as being an area in which has that opportunity to create something of a distinct identity as well. We have asked people that during this process, we've indicated that everybody's idea is a good idea, that we're not taking any ideas off the table. So some people, for example, may look at the baseball stadium and say, no, that's a really bad location, or whatever. We're really interested in hearing the diversity of ideas at this point, because it's this information we want to bring back to you as we make further discussions. That's question one. Question two on the citywide map is a sort of fundamental challenge. Where do we locate housing in the most general sense? Do we load it all in downtown? Do we push it up into the hillsides? Are there other locations, given that we have an incredible demand for housing within our 7-year cycle? We are committed to, and as Mark will talk about, of providing capacity for over 8,000 housing units. Where do those go to? How do we begin to think about dispersing those within the city, and also recognition that 8,000 number is really only for this immediate time frame, the next 7 years, for the housing element. And during the life of a 2050 general plan, we're going to have 3 or so rounds of these kinds of housing commitments we're going to have to make for the future. So we talk about housing. Similarly, we talk about commercial uses, in that we heard very clearly in the first round of workshops that a lot of people go outside the city for some of their basic shopping needs. They go to Rancho, they go to Redlands, they may go to Ontario, they may go to other locations. So the question is, if you begin to think about where you can begin to concentrate commercial activities, where would those be in this city? And then the last question that we go to the public with as in these group exercises is, it's not all bricks and mortar, but indeed there are the places that you want to protect, preserve as they are today. Maybe it's some neighborhoods that you think are really, let's not touch those neighborhoods. And of course, a lot of residential neighborhoods, those are very important places for the people who live there, and they do want to protect those neighborhoods. Maybe some open spaces, et cetera. We talked about the hillsides, we talked about some other areas, et cetera. So that's the second question. And what you will see, the outcomes of this, which will be a series of maps that people have marked up with responses to these questions. So this is the whoops, somehow the map disappeared. Okay. We'll pretend that you saw a citywide map up there. The second exercise, it really focuses on the ward. Let me just make sure it's in the, because if you don't see it on the screen, and we did, yes, it is. Aha. Thank you. It's printed on the handout. That's, at least we got it visually. You can see it. You have your own personal copy of it. You don't have to look at the screen. And the second question exercise is specific to each city council ward. And remember the last time we got together, we had the maps on the table that were basically hand-drawn. They're no longer hand-drawn. But we took those maps to the community with those areas that were circled as being possible areas of consideration. We called them focus areas. And then we've asked the participants to identify in those areas what they would see the future of those areas to be. And I'll show you how we do that in a moment. We basically have what we call a land use workbook, which has photographs of different types of uses. And basically we ask people to point to basically the photograph of what they would see in a particular area, and then we have a little legend that correlates the image and that legend is indicated on a map, et cetera. So, here's one of the wards that is just in representation of how we've translated your map. So you see the dark outlines, et cetera, are the areas that we talked about at our last meeting here with you. And indeed, for each of those areas, we then have this land use workbook. You can see here photographs of different types of residential, different types of housing, different types of commercial, industrial uses, and open space uses. And basically, if you see this map, you'll see on the left-hand column a legend, and people then identify on those bubble areas you saw on the map an image and basically correlated to what they would see and suggest in that particular area themselves. We also, very importantly, want to give the public the opportunity to say, there's some other areas. You've identified these areas, through the discussion with the GPAC, et cetera. So there may be some other areas that we think should have the opportunity for some kind of change. So the last question we asked during this phase of the workshop is, are there other areas that you would consider some other uses? And if so, identify those on the map and to identify and record, again, the land use options. So it's this information that we're going through. It's a very hands-on visual. I think the visuals really help because it takes away from the discussion, is it just housing? It makes it real in terms of looking at imagery of real kinds of development options. By the way, these are images that we shared with you at the real rush through at the end of your last meeting as well. Though they've been edited somewhat, we reduced the number of images for the purposes of the discussion. So any question about what we've been doing at the workshops? Again, all this information is going to be documented, will be posted on the project website so people can see what the results were, see what they did, see what they said, and then again we'll be bringing that back to you in the meeting that we're talking about coming up in May.
Any questions?
I just have one question, Woody. At the risk of spoiling the ending, were there any surprising or really intriguing ideas that have come out of the workshop so far?
I have not had the opportunity to look at all the maps. I think where I saw, at least, I do wander from group to group to group and listen to the conversations. I've seen some interesting ideas on the citywide scale when people have been thinking about a citywide context. And I will want to go back and take a look at those because there were some that were, I'll definitely put in what I would say the creative area when people have been thinking about on a citywide basis, yes. We've had people, of course, comment upon other kinds of aspects of what's important to the community. We've had one group in particular emphasize green technologies, solar, green buildings, being more sustainable. We had another group do talk about the labor, having good jobs within the community. But what we did in those exercises, we asked everybody to mark those onto Post-it notes because that's not topic tonight. But we don't want to lose those ideas because those will be subject to other sections of the general plan once we get into the policy writing as well. And there have been a number of those comments that we have received as well. And again, all those will be documented, et cetera, for you to review as well. The discussions have been good. The beauty, what we do is after each breakout group has their exercise, we then have a report out. So everybody in the group can see what the other groups in the full audience would say. So we've had as many as, I think, 6 breakout groups at one of the workshops, and as few as 2 this week. That was the smallest attendance we had, but they generally run 3, 4, or depending upon the attendance, the numbers of the groups that attend as well. So it's interesting. We like to do it that way because we like to see what the diversity of the input is, and see if there's a commonality beginning to surface, or if we're beginning to get different differences of opinions. And it's really where we have differences of opinions we want to focus on.
One thing I noticed that was not answered rightly was a lot of people started with, because it was the second ward, and so a lot of the people there lived around this neighborhood. Yep. And they saw baseline. And Baseline has a lot of liquor stores. It has whole sections not developed of any business or anything, or old businesses in old buildings. It's just really old. And then there'd be a new car wash business there, and squatties, and then old, and then so forth. And they started by asking, why don't they do anything about that, or we need the whole district developed and so forth. And then, but that was really secondary to what would you like to see, you know, and
Absolutely.
so forth and so forth. And I hope you noted that, because even with the housing element, one gentleman said his house is over by St. Bernardine's and it's old and he could barely get into it, and then he could not afford to make repairs. And if they had some kind of a program where they would offset some of the repair costs for I need a new roof, I need to fix the floor, I need to fix the windows and so forth, that would be better than to bulldoze it and build a whole new.
Yeah, you got to.
And several of the people who were in my group were renters, long-term renters, 20 years renting, 8 years renting, and so they were still looking for affordable housing. And it wasn't really addressed, I think, adequately. The facilitator just kept asking, well, what would you like to see? What would, you know, the biggest suggestion that they had was, I thought was crucial, because it is practically empty. And that is where there was a retail outlet where the Good and the Smart and Final used to be. And now that whole area is practically empty.
Yep.
And they needed to have that more modernized as a retail outlet, and we picked out and so forth and so forth. But I thought that was a very good suggestion that was made. So it was half and half. It was what we're looking for to see in the future and what we need now in that community.
I think another observation, there's a lot of interest in mixed-use types of development, recognizing, especially on a bigger parcel like that, where you have width and depth, et cetera, that you have the opportunity to begin to think about that as well, and the balance with commercial as well.
But I think that between the general planning and what the residents are saying, you ought to somehow meld them together so that they meet the need.
Exactly.
Okay.
If I may add to that, keep in mind that the general plan in and itself does not cause things to happen. So, you know, right now we're in the visioning process that we're setting the goals, you know, and so there's nothing in itself that the general plan is going to do with that Smart and Final property, you know. So what we want to do is the following steps will be, what are the programs, what are the policies, and so the policies will be, well, okay, so we are hearing in these workshops, well, we have this center, we have this block, we have these properties. That's everywhere. We hear that message, and so what's going to be important for us when we start looking at the policies as a city, what programs or what are we going to do to change that? Not that we're going to change it. As an example, so we have that Smart and Final property. There's people that call on that site every day. You know, what can I do there? And our zoning's limited on what kind of uses we can. A gas station will go there all day long, you know, a convenience store. But we want, as you said, we want more. You know, we want things that are different, right? And so when we start looking at our general plan and our development code, the development code is really the implementing piece. That's what tells you what you could do with the piece of property. The general plan doesn't. It gives you the broad stroke of what kind of land use. It's commercial, residential, industrial, whatever the case is. But the zoning code will tell you, here's what type of use you can put in there, the type of business, how big it can be, how much parking you need, how much landscaping. And so keep that in mind when we start, and when we do the development code update, when that comes before you, we are going to provide you with a comparative analysis so you can see, well, today, you know, these zoning districts require, these are the setbacks. These are the height limitations, and so forth. Everyone's saying mixed use, mixed use. Guess what? Today, our code does not address mixed use. Even if you wanted to, I mean, we'd have to do a development code amendment, or there would be a special process for that type of use. And so now that we're hearing the community saying mixed use, mixed use, mixed use, yeah, we are listening. Mixed use will be in there, and so we will be saying in our development code, okay, you want mixed use. This is what is involved with that. You know, so that's going to be taller buildings. You know, there's going to be less open space. You know, and you know, a chairperson as a commissioner, when we have like multifamily projects when they come before you, and there's a code requirement for how much open space you have to have, and you know, your private patios and all those kinds of things. In a mixed use project, all that gets reworked. You know, and so we'll keep that in mind. So there's like 3 or 4 parallel tracks that we're running on here, and so it's taking the comments and it's like, okay, where does it go here? Yes, we hear loud and clear. You know, the vacant buildings, what are we going to do with those? They're all over the place, and in our major corridors as well. You know, we're taking an ordinance to the city council on the 6th. What are we doing with vacant buildings? For a standard on how they're going to be boarded up. You know, because we have a lot of them. They remain open, and then bad things happen there. You know, and then we end up with a destroyed structure or something like that. And so we're listening to these things, and we're taking our notes, we're putting them in our box, and when that time comes, you know, we'll be addressing that bit. But by all means, those comments have to keep coming out. You know, we're not trying to stifle that. So when we're saying, okay, we heard you, but we really need to focus on this, you know, and so that's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to. It takes a certain synergy, you know. So if you've gone to a few of these, you start to pick up a rhythm, and you know, the first workshop that you go to, it's like you know, committee member Bell, you went to one of the workshops. I would encourage you to go to some of the other ones, because now you see you've already seen the movie. You know what the process is, and you probably left there, or I'm going to presume that you left there with, you know, wondering. It's like, so if I go back again, now I know what they're asking for. Now, you know, now that I thought about it, I have some other ideas, and that's what we're asking you to do. So each of these workshops is building upon what you picked up the previous time. You know, this is it's like a 2-year class, right, Woody? Where we, you know, each meeting we're learning new material. We all are. I mean, we've been in this profession for a while, but we're learning what's important to the community as well. You know, so we got to keep that dynamic, and we encourage the comments. Nothing of what we hear is a criticism. You know, because we're jotting everything down, and in the end, you will say, okay, that's where it belonged. You know, and then we're good. So I'll jump off my soapbox, and we'll let Woody go. I'm good at that, lady.
I think what you have said, you know, and we know, but the people who come to these visioning workshops do not always know, and there isn't always enough time to tell them that. And it's kind of like, I think it was Mr. Rothschild. He asked the question, well, how are you going to bridge the visioning with the reality of what is happening now? And I think that's a valid question. Well, how are you going to bridge in the visioning with the reality, at least within these people's lifetimes? What is it going to be? And putting it into a toolbox is okay, as long as it gets taken out again in its appropriate time.
One of the other comments, just so we should all, is again, one of the pieces we may keep forgetting about that's part of the general plan is going to be an economic development element. So as we look at that site that was identified and indicate a use, one of the charges to the economic development element is looking at business attraction, business retention or attraction. There will be a section of policies addressing that. Now, that will not be focused on every individual parcel in the city. It'll be a high-level approach that ultimately gets implemented through something called a strategic economic plan that the city councils ultimately adopt as well. But I think it's a step saying, well, if there is this vision of the community to, let's say, revitalize that property into something that becomes, I'm going to just characterize it as a neighborhood center, whatever it is, whatever comes out of the planning process, et cetera, there will be some guidance, and especially these corridors being, I had some time to kill today, so I drove, again, all of Baseline and all of Highland from one end to the other. There's a lot of needed change, if you will. I'll use that term, or opportunity for change on those corridors. I was amazed, actually. I didn't realize the scale of how many businesses are closed and boarded up along that corridor, beyond, especially in some segments, a lot of vacant properties. So anyway, but there will be this whole emphasis upon not just creating capacity through plans and land use designations, but also how do we make things work economically, which also ties in a little bit some of the things we've been hearing from the unions about how do we elevate, if you will, the skill sets and capabilities of, if you will, residents to move up the ladder in terms of jobs and so forth. And that's all part of the economic development strategy that moves forward. Yep.
Any other questions? Was just as long as we can
Bring them together.
bring them together. Okay.
Then I'm going to go, and excuse me for this, I had actually talked to you about moving this around.
Yes.
Lynette was unable to join us tonight, so pretend I'm Lynette. Don't pretend I'm Lynette. Just basically her usual routine on the public outreach, et cetera. This, I mentioned, and I wanted to do this one in particular because this is, as I indicated, we have right now online, go online. It's actually, it'll be a fun exercise for you to go online and do this, our regular general plan website, and you will find a reference to the virtual participation program. And what you're going to see here on the right-hand side of the screen is the maps, the various areas of the city. And again, the lighting in this room doesn't help us, but at the very left hand of the screen over there, let me point on here. Well, if it worked, on the very left-hand side of the screen are tabs that say Ward 1, Ward 2, Ward 3, Ward 4, et cetera. And you can click on that tab, and on the right-hand side, there will be the equivalent map like you saw that we did the in-person workshops for that have all of the areas that we have identified. And then you will see in the next column over then a list of those areas, just as we handled for any of you in the workshop, and those have been facilitator guides. You will see each of those areas. And you click on that, and then it will also pull up then the images that you saw up there on the screen for the land use workbook. And people, it's called social pinpoint. So you put a pin on the site and identify the use, just as we've been doing it in real time, live, et cetera. And there's some introductory text to this section that I think explains it better than I'm doing right now to help people understand, et cetera, how this is to be used. But this is now, as I said, live. It will remain live until the middle of April. So for those two things, for those who attended the workshops and may have wanted a little more understanding and explanation about some of the uses opportunities, this is an opportunity to do that. It's not restricted to those who did not attend the workshops, but we also would like to those who did not attend the workshops also participate. A number of CBOs in town, I think 4 or 5, are actually going to be taking this to their groups and to get them to also participate in this mapping exercise as well. So this is it's previously said in progress. Well, it is in progress right now. It's something that is going on, and we finally were able to activate it, I think, today or yesterday, in terms of getting it ready and running as well. So this is another forum for public input and a venue for that throughout the process. And again, similarly to, everything that we got in the live workshops, we'll be documenting and bringing back to you for consideration as well. So that is sort of the major, if I will call, segue step from what we've been doing, and when we conclude the in-person plans. Just again for your information, even though it's not technically this group, the downtown specific plan is moving forward. I encourage you all to attend Saturday. The Arts Festival is again going to occur. We, at that festival, will have something called a Go Human campaign. A Go Human campaign is about how we move around in the community using other forms of transportation besides our automobile. And it's a real, this is actually something that is put together by SCAG, and we have access to their workshop kit, and basically it's a real, as you can see the photographs, it's a real physical thing where you actually move things around on the street. We will be at the intersection of D and Court Street, which will be right across from where the Arts Festival is being conducted. This is scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. and conclude at 4 or something. 4 p.m., so plenty of time to come. If you have not seen the Go Human, I've seen it in some other cities. It's a real kind of fun time and get people involved, and it makes it real. It's beyond planners just talking. It's in language that people understand. I'm not just speaking English, Spanish. I'm talking about physical language that people can relate to as well. I think we're still going to have some bicyclists coming, Harold. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Because we're bringing in the bicycling community also to be a part of this process as well. So that's this Saturday. Encourage you to attend. Plus, you get to see and participate in the Arts Festival on top of that. So this is a major event on Saturday. And then the downtown plan, as we conclude our community workshops in each of the wards. We have 2 workshops scheduled, in-person workshops scheduled for the downtown plan, taking it the next step. So to remind everybody about where that plan is, the City Council last night basically supported the basic districts. The downtown's been divided into 10 to 11 separate districts, somewhat treated, they're all unified and connected, but there are some different scales of uses and intensities and ideas for those areas. And they will be getting into these workshops that are coming up, the development standards for each of those districts and uses as well. So that's coming up, one at the library on the 5th, and then one at the senior center on the 7th of the month as well. So those are other public participation activities that are coming up. There are lots happening right now, and it's good. It's creating, I think, a degree of momentum. I won't go through all this. Remember we had some discussions when the first round of workshops about how the word's getting out, how people are getting hearing about all of these meetings, et cetera. I think you can see that they're beginning to work, and that we had over 50 again attend on Saturday. I'm not going to go through all these. We have a video that is, do you want to talk about the video? Just share everybody what the video is.
Of course. So Harold and I worked very hard to create we call it a PSA for the community. So one in English and one in Spanish, so we can reach as many people as possible. Currently, it's posted on Facebook and on Instagram, but it really encourages the public to come out to the workshops. It lets them know what it is, what it's for, why we're asking for their participation. So it would help us if you could share the video, tell people about it. It just kind of brings to life what we've been trying to put on paper and tell them why it's so important to come out and really gain more participation from the public.
Thank you, Stephanie. And as you see down here also, there's a greater involvement using the CBOs in town who are all, and will all, too many for all.
I'm sorry, Stephanie, what's the easiest way to find that video?
So on Instagram and Facebook, we're SB City CED.
Okay.
And it's posted on both of those.
So again, we're working and collaborating with the CBOs, a number of their events that they're coming up to comparable, and they will be, as I said, using the social pinpoint mapping exercise, et cetera, for their groups, et cetera. So anyway, without going through all this in detail, I think some of the other keys here is we're now active on Facebook and Instagram, as I think we mentioned, thanks to Stephanie's great work of getting us on there, and other means of outreach, e-blasts, et cetera, to get the word out as well. You should also know that the second session of the Community Guide to Planning Initiative, and is basically being led by National Core, was conducted. We had I think we had 6 or 7 participants first go around. We had 24. This is intended to be limited, though, in attendance because of the nature of the training session itself. So 24 is a good number. English, Spanish participation as well. And the second session focused on, and actually was intended to be conducted before the first of the community workshops, because it was an opportunity for the participants to learn about the land use planning exercise, and what land use planning is, and provide input and to become educated about that as well. And it was both in-person and virtual options were available for that as well. So any questions about this rather robust program of outreach that's going on? Can I bring my mic? Definitely.
Video, Stephanie?
The videos are only just over a minute.
Okay.
So I think one is just over and one runs a little bit longer. The Spanish is a little bit longer, but they're really just over a minute.
Why couldn't you show it here?
I absolutely could. I could queue it up and have it ready at the end of the presentation tonight.
Okay. Okay.
Okay?
Could we,
Of course.
please? All
Yes.
right. Okay.
We're making Stephanie work tonight. Make copies. Okay, you do a
I've got the
video.
popcorn.
And any food you can bring us? No, just, okay.
Okay, so are we ready to move on
We're
then
ready to move on.
with Mr. Hoffman?
Yes, thank you. Okay, well, all right, well, thank you very much. And so this will be our second meeting discussion on the housing element. And before I begin, I just want to make sure, in our last meeting, we spoke at length about the housing needs assessment and many of the trends, the demographic trends, the housing trends, the conditions of properties, et cetera, that really form the basis for identifying needs in the community. And I just want to make sure, was everybody here? Was there anyone who had missed that presentation or had any questions? Okay, good, good. So at this point, what I would like to do is just move it to the next step in the process. And we've talked a lot about outreach, so I'm going to skim through this actually very quickly. But basically, we're right now in between Phase 1 and Phase 2, and our discussion here tonight will focus on the RHNA, which is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and sites for new housing, as well as the Fair Housing Assessment. And there's quite a bit of outreach that's going to go along with that, but I'll save that for later. So I think where I'd like to start off with, this is going to be a little bit educational, but I would also like to get your input on housing, the types of housing that's needed. I'd like to be able to communicate to you how is zoning related to housing. So when you think about the land use plan, you can think about, well, what type of housing is being allowed and where, and then also some of the fair housing concerns that arise partially because of the work that was done in 2020 and 2021 with your analysis of impediments, and then moving forward for the housing element. So the first thing really is, what is the regional housing needs allocation? And it's something that we refer to as RHNA. It sounds kind of medical, but it's called RHNA for short. And the RHNA is a key requirement of your housing element for the 2021-2029 8-year planning period. And what the RHNA is designed to do in its most simplest form is to ensure that you're planning enough housing to accommodate all the needs you have here in the city, and particularly the growth needs that are going to occur from 2021 to 2029. There are other places of the housing element where we look more at existing needs in terms of programs and meeting rehabilitation, repair needs, but the RHNA is more designed for growth. And by the way, we'll talk about the other program needs at a later date. In brief, the Southern California Association of Governments is tasked with the Regional Housing Needs Assessment and determining how much growth each city should plan for. And they do that by looking at your population growth in the past, your past employment growth as well as future employment growth, transit, fair housing. There's a number of different considerations that they put together in a model, and they figure out how much each city should be planning for. And what cities are responsible for doing is basically finding sites, identifying, zoning appropriate sites for housing. That's the planning task here, as well as having some responsive housing programs that help housing being built. What the RHNA does not do, it does not require the city to build units. It doesn't require the city to fund units. What it really is, it's a planning mandate. So just quickly, where does the regional housing needs come from? So about every 8 years, the state of California has population projections throughout the state, up and down the state from the top to the bottom. They look at what is the growth that's going to happen in the state of California from 2029 to 2021 to 2029. And based upon that, the Department of Housing and Community Development, they take those population growth totals and they figure out, based upon how many people are going to be in the state, how much housing needs to be produced so we can accommodate the growth. We know we're going to grow. We got to figure out how we're going to grow and how much we need to grow. And that's what the state does. Those numbers then comes down to something called the Southern California Association of Governments. And so, for example, the Southern California Association of Governments was assigned 1.3 million housing units from 2021 to 2029. That's the growth need. And then from there, they allocate how much housing needs to be planned for in each city. 10,000 here, 5,000 there, 400 there, and the city of San Bernardino's allocation is approximately 8,000 units. So that's where we actually get the number from. Now, once we get that number, which is about 8,100 units, the question is, what kind of housing needs to be built? Is it all single family? Is it all multiple family? Is it special needs? What really is it? And so what the state does, it divides that into 4 income categories. The income categories that you see on your chart, the first one is very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And for each of those income classifications, there's a range. So for example, looking at very low, that would be housing that's affordable to a household earning up to about $37,000 a year. If you're a moderate income household, the home would be affordable to an income upwards of $90,000 a year. And so when you kind of think about that, you start to get a sense of, okay, if we're looking at above moderate and moderate income housing, it's probably single family homes. And if we're looking at very low and low, we're probably looking some type of affordable apartment product, accessory dwelling unit, something like that. And so what this chart also says is how many units need to be built for each of those planning categories. So for example, very low income, the allocation is 1,415 units. For low, it's about 1,000, moderate, about 1,400, and then above moderate is 4,200. And you're probably wondering why the higher number for above moderate income, and it's because the city has quite a bit of affordable housing historically, and so they're allowed to build and allocate a higher percentage for above mod. And those are the percentages. So we look at it very low and low together is about 30%, 31%. Moderate's about 18% of the allocation, and above mod is about 51%. So the question then is, how do we actually address the RHNA? How do we do it now? We know it's a planning mandate, but what does state law allow us to do to show that we're actually meeting that? And there's really 3 ways. The first way, number 1, is any new home that's built in the city can be credited against that RHNA target. So you have 8,100. If you have 400 homes that are being built, your number goes from 8,100 to 7,700. And that's kind of an accounting exercise. The second way is, and I'm going to jump down to number 3, is counting alternative credits. Things like accessory dwelling units, rehabilitation and preservation, motel conversions, things like that. Those are alternative credits. And then finally, once we count all the credits in terms of housing being built, the last one is, what do we do to fill the gap? because there's not enough housing that's going to be built. That's where we're planning for housing. And we're making sure that we have enough land zoned for the right types of housing in the right location. And so that's kind of the last piece. So I'm going to walk through each of these methods. So first, number one, housing production. And this is counting all the new housing units that are being built or planned to be built. So for example, you have a number of projects that have already been approved for development. They're in the pipeline. They're going to be developed. Those all count toward the 8100. And we'll document the affordability, et cetera. Now, we can't count group quarters like assisted living. It's something that's not eligible. It has to be an actual physical, independent housing unit. The next one is counting alternative credits. Now, there's ways that housing units are built, but they're just non-traditional housing units. So, for example, I know you recently have a permanent supportive housing project for a hotel conversion, the All-Star Lodge. That counts toward your housing production. Accessory dwelling units, dozens are being approved and built every year. Those also count. And also, if you rehabilitate and preserve units under certain conditions, those can count as well. So say, for example, there's an old hotel or an old apartment project and the city wants to put a couple million and fix it up and make it affordable. That would count towards your production requirements. So a lot of terms here, but essentially we're counting units that are being built and we're counting kind of creative ways that units are being built. And so let me jump back to the last one, and that is identifying and designating adequately zoned sites. That's the way that we fill the gap. And that's what Woody's been doing with the land use plan, identifying those areas where housing could go and the types of housing. So as you see the chart in front of you, this is just a simplified chart, but it gives you a sense of the type of housing that would be built, generally the type of affordability that would be associated with that housing unit, and then what kind of zones that would be built. So say, for example, you're looking at your above moderate income requirement, 51%, 4,000 units. Those are typically single-family homes. Those single-family homes are typically built in very low-density areas, your RE, your RL, and your RS zones. So we'll be looking to see, is there enough capacity for 4,000 housing units in the RE, RL, and RS zone for single-family homes? Okay? The second tier is, say, for example, condos and apartments, smaller kind of attached products. They're typically affordable for moderate income. Not always, sometimes it's above moderate, but generally moderate. And so those typically are found in medium density zones, your RU, your RM zones. So we'll be looking at that allocation of approximately 1,400 and saying, do we have enough sites in the RU and the RM zones to accommodate the need? Okay, so we're matching housing types with zones. The last category would be apartments. And apartments are those that would most likely be affordable to either low or moderate income households. The apartments are only allowed in few zones that are higher density, and you probably know those are the RM and RH zones, and some of your corridors allow for higher density products. So kind of stepping back, we know what the allocation is. We can get a sense of what type of housing has to be built to meet that, and then we're going to be matching it up with zoning. It's somewhat of an exercise, and it is very involved, but that's what we're trying to do. And so when we're looking for acceptable sites for housing, I just want to put up on the screen a few of the criteria that we have to pay attention to be able to write it in the housing element, and ultimately to have the state of California Department of Housing and Community Development accept our strategy. So when we're identifying sites for housing, things that we'll be looking at is suitable size. Are the sites large enough? We don't want fragments, but are they large enough for good housing products? Secondly, are there lots of constraints or no constraints? Flooding, fire, fault zones, things like that. We want to make sure that we don't choose sites that have constraints. A third criteria is having housing by right. So for example, we can only count a site if we can actually build on it by right. If it's a conditional use permit, it still allows housing, but it won't qualify for state for credit. And there's a couple other considerations. Fair housing, we want to make sure the zoning's right. Feasibility if sites have to turn over. But these are the criteria that we look at when we evaluate where's the best sites to build. Okay?
Let me jump in on the
Sure.
feasibility for a second. This round of housing elements, this is kicked into a higher level of importance because a lot of cities would, for their housing elements, look at, for example, some of your strip commercial corridors and basically say those are suitable, or a store or a grocery store that's closed or something of that nature, and say that's a site that's suitable for housing. The state now requires that you demonstrate that that property can feasibly be redeveloped for housing. So if you have extraordinary costs for, let's say, demolition of an existing building, et cetera, land costs of acquisition, that may kick into the consideration as well. And also, in one city, we've had to go to the property owners to get a letter indicating that they would be interested in converting a commercial property to residential. So the burden of proof relative to feasibility has been significantly ratcheted up in this go-round. The state is sort of tired of cities blanketly showing areas as being potential for housing, and it's not happened. And so there is indeed an expectation now that you need to be able to demonstrate, yes, that can happen.
So a follow-up question on that one. You talked about converting commercial use to residential. What's the standard for converting it to mixed use?
Well, I think
it's not so much a standard. It's the demonstrating. I think number one is getting, let's say, a property owner to say, yes, I'm really interested in converting to mixed use or housing, et cetera. And then there are what we call financial analyses that can be conducted of what the actual costs of conversion are. Something called a pro forma analysis. We actually run through numbers to indicate the financial feasibility to the developer to convert, or identify subsidies that are provided that then reduce the costs.
But if you're looking at a corridor like Baseline that you just visited, would you need to do that for every single property, or can you do that as a general plan?
You can do prototypicals.
But I think, though, the point being is that the exercise, this part of the housing element, has become quite burdensome, and it is quite difficult to get it through HCD because they're really looking at, bottom line, do we think housing can be built at this location over the next 8 years?
Well, and I was going to say, just to give you an example, the deadline for all this to have been completed, if you will, they gave you a buffer, which was February of this year. And so far in the region, out of 180 some odd,
197, yeah.
197 cities, there are only 6 that have been confirmed so far. So give you an indication of how difficult this has become.
So it is quite a challenge, but we will continue on. And so, the second part that I wanted to just chat with you about is furthering fair housing. And at our last meeting, we talked about the fact that a new state law called AB 686 was adopted by the California legislature. And what that basically did, it said that there is a federal mandate to affirmatively further fair housing. What it did is it took that federal mandate, put it in state law, and said now the housing element has to do it. And so many of the requirements that would have come under the federal requirement now have become state law. And so what it has done to the housing element is made it even more substantially voluminous. It's added, significant amount of analysis to the housing element, and it's raised the bar in terms of what the housing element has to contain. And what it has also done is it makes sure it requires public agencies to take meaningful actions that overcomes segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access not only to housing, but to other opportunities based on protected status. That's quite a bit, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that. But meaningful actions means it has to address significant disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity, replace segregated living patterns, transform concentrated areas of poverty, and foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. Quite a bit to chew on. So this is a new federal mandate that now is being put into the housing element. And so what are those requirements? As you can see the graphic up on top, the first one is outreach. They want to know that we've spoken to the community and that we've heard their concerns. Secondly, there will be an assessment of fair housing. That will contain a needs assessment as well as an opportunity analysis. And we'll talk more about that. There are requirements for the housing sites inventory. And then finally, there's a housing plan, which are the priorities, goals, and actions to address fair housing. Very substantive requirements. So what is the fair housing outreach that's been done to date? Fortunately, in 2020, you undertook a fair housing study along with your consolidated plan update. I don't know if you recall that. It was about a year and a half to 2 years ago, which had extensive community outreach. There were public hearings. There was a comprehensive needs survey, stakeholder interviews, community workshops, pop-up events, as well as a housing summit. All of this just occurred a year and a half to 2 years ago. And as a result of all that effort, a number of issues were identified and priorities were set forth. And what we want to do with the housing element is make sure that we don't lose all of that terrific input that was provided. It's very recent. It's in 2020. It should be relevant today. And so we'd like to be able to carry that forward to the extent it still applies for the housing element. I think it's a great foundation, and you're one of the few cities that has done that already.
How often do you have to do the outreaches?
Pardon?
How often do you have to do the outreaches?
The outreach is required every time that you would have to update the housing element. That would be the requirement. However, you can do it more often. I have housing elements that I've worked on that they periodically do outreach every 2 to 3 years. But in terms of the actual requirement, it needs to be done as a foundation for the housing element.
Yeah, the housing element cycle is 8 years, just
yes.
FYI.
So what I would like to do is go through the fair housing assessment. I'm just going to focus on 4 or 5 maps and the findings that were indicated in the fair housing study that was done in 2020. And I'd like you to really take a look at those and see how those resonate with you, and if those are really still applicable, or if they deserve more tweaking, or if there's something that's missing. And so the first thing I'm going to do is look at segregation and poverty. Then I'm going to look at 4 maps that look at kind of housing resources, economic development, educational opportunity, and environmental opportunity, which is new. That was not included in your fair housing study, but we're required to include it in the housing element. So here's the first map, is segregation and poverty. And the reason why this is important for the state and is why it's important for us to consider is that we do know that housing needs are most pressing in areas which have segregation or in areas that are impoverished. And there's a state and federal designated areas that we need to be especially cognizant of. And so as you can see on this map, the dark areas, the dark purple, are those areas which have the greatest level of poverty in the city. They're also encircled by the red outline. There's another one in terms of a race and ethnic concentration of poverty, and those have the hatch marks. So those are the dark areas encircled by they have a red border and a hatch mark. Those are the areas that are most in need. And it's probably no surprise to you, Central City, West Side, East Side, right? Pretty much just right across the center of the city, dipping down into the south sector. Those are the areas that are most in need. So the second map that I wanted to show is what we call a composite resource map. What this resource map does, it averages a number of things together. It averages economic opportunity, it averages environmental opportunity, educational opportunity, to show kind of the total level of resources that you have here in the community. And it should be of no surprise. When you look at the center area, the yellow area, those are the areas that are most in need. They're very closely I mean, if you look at the poverty map and you look at the areas that are yellow, it pretty much mirrors itself. Then outside of the city central, you have an area which is slightly kind of a darker yellow. Those are the low resource areas. As you go further out in a circle, you hit the moderate resource areas, which are areas which are actually have more, better educational outcomes, better employment outcomes, et cetera. And as you go out even further, you get the high resource areas, and those are the best educational, housing, employment resources. So that's really how the map looks like. And by the way, this is not uncommon for a central city, a large city. If you look at many of the other large cities, it's the same thing. The areas typically in the core are the ones that are the most need, and the further you go out, they have less needs. So I would like to talk then about economic development. And what this map also shows is a composite or a total economic score. And what does that economic score mean? Well, it's not just available jobs. It's also about the availability of a skilled workforce. It looks at the educational level of residents. It looks at where residents are with respect to where the jobs are located. In other words, when there's more jobs closer to them that are suitable, the scores are higher. And there's other factors that poverty is included as well. And so what you can really see from this map is the orange area is that area of the city that scores the lowest. That's the greatest amount of economic need. And as you go outside of the core, you get to the next level, the yellow. That has a higher level, or that's a better economic situation. Then if you go even further out, you start to see the green categories. That's the best economic development. Those are the best. They score the best in terms of economic development. It's very similar to the poverty maps. And when we looked at it, there were 5 key things that came out of the Fair Housing Study at that time related to economic development. One, there was a recognition of a struggling downtown, and you really needed a mixed-use, invigorated downtown environment. It's probably no surprise, and that's why you're doing the Carousel Mall revitalization work. The second key issue was a lack of economic development incentives, business recruitment and retention. And that refers to what Woody had mentioned, your need for your economic development chapter in your general plan and your economic strategic plan to recruit businesses and to retain them. That was the second key issue. The third issue was high crime rates around the community and the fact that they tend to deter economic development. The fourth key issue was a lack of well-paying employment and high levels of underemployment. And then finally, the fifth one was limited convenient transit routes and stops to access jobs. So those are the 5 key issues that are in your Fair Housing Study as of today. It was adopted in 2020. So we can probably go through the other maps, or do you want to just stop for comment? If you have comments on those, we can take them now. If you want to just move to the next two maps and come back, we can talk about those. We can do it that way. Let's go on. Okay. So the third map is educational opportunity. And again, this looks at scores and educational levels here currently in the community, because we know that higher education typically leads to greater levels or greater skill levels for employment and for higher paid employment as well. And so there were 5 basic findings that came out of this. One is there's limited educated workforce in terms of college degrees and workforce training. In other words, more needs to be done to train your workforce. The second key issue was a lack of daycare before and after school, because simply if parents can't find affordable childcare, it's very difficult to think about education and going back to school or getting workforce training. It's not possible. The third issue was an inability to afford or have available time to pursue higher education. The fourth was generally lower performing schools than county and statewide average. And then finally, there was the quote that families were unable to prioritize higher educational achievements. It could be because of childcare needs, it could be because they're working 2 jobs, or whatever it happens to be, it was difficult to prioritize higher educational achievement. So these were the 5 major themes that came out of your fair housing study. And then finally, environmental quality. This was not covered in your analysis of impediments to fair housing, but we'll have to cover it in the housing element. And essentially the dark orange areas are those areas which have environmental concerns. The green areas are the best. The orange areas have the most challenges. And essentially, much of San Bernardino is considered to be disadvantaged due to higher levels of environmental pollution. I mean, you're an industrial city, you have an industrial past, many legacy uses in the city that contribute to pollution and will continue to do so for some time as, until industries transition. We also found that the city experiences a higher prevalence and severity of health issues. You have a population that does have some health needs here in the city. And you do have some areas in the city that are medically underserved. I mean, you do have a few hospitals and clinics, but areas in the south, southeast, and central tend to be medically underserved. And you have a mental health professional shortage for most of your cities. So these are some of the challenges that are coming out of the environmental opportunities. So that concludes just some presentation of some simple information and some maps. Some of it's a little bit, quite a bit to chew on, but those findings were listed in your fair housing study. And so really our concern or our thoughts are, does that still exist? Are those considerations still important here today to be folded into the housing element? And do you just have any questions and need clarifications?
If I may add, Mark.
Sure.
Committee members, as we discussed earlier about the implementation, kind of the general plan and then the development code and then the procedures of getting the projects done. When Mark talked about the number of housing units and the affordability, there's the different categories, the very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. The way our code is structured now, those items that typically fall under the low and the very low categories, so those are typically types of projects that require conditional use permits. So we have like the veterans housing as an example. We have some of the other social uses where they're transitional housing. Those require conditional use permits. By HUD's view, we would not be able to take credit for those projects. And so if someone came in and said, well, we want to do a housing project for very low residents or tenants, and our code requires, because it's a special needs, falls within our code of a special needs, requires a conditional use permit. Yes, congratulations, we got the project, but HUD would not, or HCD would not recognize those units. We would not be able to take credit for those. Those types of projects would have to be what are called administrative approvals, which means a developer comes in with the project, I want to build affordable housing project, or what have you, whatever that is, if it's detached, attached, high-rise, whatever the case is, it would have to be a staff level approval in order for us to get credit for it. So keep that in mind. We hear that just about every meeting, all of the workshops, we need affordable housing, attainable housing, whatever it's called. Yes, there is a need, but the city's part of it, and earlier on when we said we have to facilitate for the development, so we have to be, or to accommodate, that means we have to allow someone to do it. And so if you come in with a project and you've got to go through a process, a discretionary process, go to the planning commission, go to the city council, whatever the case is, then it doesn't qualify. And so keep that in mind, because it does become a struggle. That becomes a debate, because and communities vary from city to city. Frankly, some cities use the discretionary process, a CUP or what have you, to discourage those kinds of projects. It's like, let's make it so onerous with conditions or standards or whatever the case is, and it basically buys them out of the project. That's why those types of projects don't come in, because it doesn't pencil, you know, and so so keep that in mind when we're looking at not just for the housing projects, but other types of developments that we're looking at the city. You know, it's and when the code comes before you, it's like, okay, what do we, you know, what do we really want to do to stimulate economic development, whether it's housing, whether it's commercial development, or what have you. And so the more you hear the term streamline, you know, streamlined process, what does that mean? And that's really what HCD is looking at as it relates to housing. So I just wanted to mention that. So that's how we can facilitate it, by making it easier, essentially. Thank you.
I have a question. Can you speak a little bit more about, like, so first off, all this data is very, like, stressful. Just looking at how San Bernardino is the lowest in all these areas compared to, like, Rialto or Colton. So can you speak a little bit more about where the data, like, how is this data collected? How are these key findings taken? Yeah.
Okay, well, in terms of, there's two different ways. The maps come from a website that the Department of Housing and Community Development has put together. And all cities are required to use fairly similar maps based upon this website. It's called it's called AFH Mapper. And it's online, you can look at it, lots of different maps. And they like cities to use essentially the same type of data and information. Okay, we'll supplement it to some extent. There are some maps that are better than others, but that's kind of there's probably 100 maps on that site, and we have to use a certain set of them. So that's really the data. There are questions about whether the data is completely correct or completely appropriate, and so we do make some adjustments to try to, if the map doesn't make sense, we make some adjustments to make the map make sense. The second thing is the key issues. The issues on the right-hand side, those actually came from your analysis. It's a study called the Analysis of Impediments, and the City Council adopted that study in 2020. And it also, that study was done at the same time when you had your consolidated plan. And
Explain what a consolidated.
The consolidated plan is for every city that receives federal dollars straight to you for housing and community development. You're required to put together a consolidated plan. Now, there's some cities that don't get the money from the federal government, then they don't have to prepare a consolidated plan. But because you do, that's why you have to prepare that.
What is a consolidated plan?
The consolidated plan, what it does is when you get funds that come from the state, there'll be funds for emergency shelters, you'll get funds for street improvements, programs. What the consolidated plan does is show how you're going to spend those funds from the federal government. That's essentially what it is. Another requirement of a city your size that gets money directly from the federal government is you would be required to prepare an analysis of impediments to fair housing. And it's just because you get money directly from the federal government. Certain cities, like, for example, Yucaipa, they don't get money straight from the federal government, so they're not required to prepare the consolidated plan or the analysis of impediments. But you do. It's just a condition of receipt of funds. And that also is a plan that shows how the city is going to use various programs to improve housing opportunities. So those are what those two studies do. And I'm sorry, I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Does that make sense? Okay.
But along that, you do the action plan and the CAPER, correct?
Yes, and what the action what the action plan does is it takes those studies and say, you know what, these studies are for example, the consolidated plan goes over 5 years. The fair housing study goes over 5 years. What the action plan does is, what are you going to do every single year toward that? And then the CAPER is the reporting mechanism. After we've done it, what we said we were going to do, the CAPER actually tells the federal government, this is exactly what we did. So this is what we planned to do, and this is what we actually did. That's what the CAPER does.
I have a question. So what's the penalty if the city doesn't meet its RHNA numbers?
That's a really good question. I guess there's two things in there. There's two questions. If the city does not meet, show that there's enough adequate sites to meet the RHNA, the housing element does not get certified. If the housing element does not get certified or approved by the state, it is, there are a number of penalties that could occur. The state could withhold funding, the state could refer the housing element to the Attorney General, or you could have a lawsuit from a private entity. That's if the housing element is not approved by the state.
Yeah, there's a difference because they can't force you to produce housing.
Right.
I mean, you're creating capacity for housing because it's the private sector generally that develops the majority of housing as well. And we have recessions, so you can't account for, recessionary times.
So
Right. So let's say the plan's approved and
The housing's not built.
the housing's not built. Then
Yeah.
what?
I guess the long and short of it is that there is no penalty.
There is no penalty.
Okay.
Because what you've done, the city would have fulfilled its mandate for planning. That's what you've done. And under state law, cities are required to plan for housing. And as long as you plan for it and it's certified by the state, you're in good shape.
How does the city track the actual housing unit and the type of housing unit? So,
Okay.
if we have, 31%, 12%, and so forth. Because, you know what's being built, but you don't actually know who's living in there in terms of the income.
Okay, so what you would do in a situation like that, or what all cities are required to do, is to prepare something called an annual progress report. Much like what you mentioned for your federal funds, you talked about the CAPER and the action plan. You would prepare an annual progress report. That annual progress report would document every single housing unit that's been built in the city and the affordability of that unit.
So somehow you asked in the process the question, who's buying the house? What income level?
What we would do
Sales
is
price.
it would be determined by the sales price of the home
And the rent.
and the rent of the home. And you can typically, that's something you can actually find out. And it's not that challenging. But so we would go through and every single accessory dwelling unit, every single permanent supportive housing, every single apartment, every single family home and condo and townhome, the city actually has to report on them.
And how about the square footage? Obviously the code has a certain square footage to determine a bedroom size, but does the RHNA dictate the size of the bedroom or the size of the unit? No?
No, it doesn't.
Is there any city that you've heard of with similar issues, with San Bernardino, like a success story, was come out of
I think overall, I guess I'll take it in two different ways. Most cities don't meet the production goals because they're typically...
I'm not specifically talking about the arena. I'm just talking about the data, going back to the data, like poverty and economic development issues and resource issues. Is there any other city that you've ever...
For a big city, the city of LA is probably the best in the state in terms of meeting various income levels, et cetera. And partially they've done that through what they call their transit-oriented community strategies, TOC strategies, which provide significant bonus densities and by right development for projects that are in proximity to transit stations. But there's a high percentage of that bonus density attributable to more affordable units.
And I think
the city of LA is one of the few that actually has met its RHNA in the past.
I think what you can also, this new mandate, the fair housing mandate, it just came out 2 years ago, so the jury is still out. We don't really have a whole track record of many cities implementing this because it just started 2 years ago. But the way I would probably see it is that wherever a city's at currently, they didn't get there overnight. It took decades and decades and decades, right? And so I think there are incremental steps and processes along the way that cities can take to make progress. So I'm working with one city that has significant infrastructure and infrastructure challenges, very, very significant. No sidewalks, no sewers, flooding issues. And what they've done over the years is gradually, one by one, requiring sewers. They lifted all the properties out of a floodplain. Took a tremendous amount of work to do that. They're installing, sidewalks. They're rehabilitating roads. And it's just taken quite a bit of time, probably 10, 15 years. And they've done that because these two areas of the city happen to be distressed and underserved. And they have a concentration of mobile homes and just some real issues going on. But they've taken the approach that their way that they're going to improve that area is not necessarily direct services, but the way they can do it is through infrastructure. And by putting in infrastructure, that relieves the cost of developers having to go in and build it. And so that's one way you can do it. Now, there may be other cities that have do it on a social service perspective. So, for example, I'm working with the city of La Habra. I'll give you an example. They do workforce training, and they used to just do workforce training for a couple cities in North Orange County. They were so successful that they just recently have a new contract to do workforce training for virtually every city in the county, 32 out of 34 cities. Tremendous. They also have a very aggressive child care program, millions and millions of dollars for child development. That's really what that city is noted for. So you have to really go city by city and look at the little success stories. And some are grand, some are, direct services, some are infrastructure, and figure out what can you do, what can the city do within its own power and its ability to make improvements. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Okay.
If I may add to that as well, we will actually have our own case study, if you will, with the Carousel Mall site. So we have the downtown area we've identified as about 600 acres. Sort of going from like 8th Street down to Rialto, from the freeway to about Sierra, Arrowhead, that boundary. And based on our if you recall, our land use districts, when we looked at possible densities and what have you, we're looking at a range of between 11 and 15,000 new units within the downtown area. The Carousel Mall site itself is projected at about 4,000 units, and that project, their expectancy of implementation is about a 10 to 12 year period. So that's something that we will be able to look at it in a more tangible sense, rather than the large scale of the 65 square miles that we have in the city. We're able to zero in and probably within this cycle, this next 8-year cycle, I think we're going to make some good progress. Whether or not we make that 8,000 units, but kind of to your point, I think we'll be able to show some progress. I think when we look at these maps, and the goal is to change some of those colors, take us from one category to the other, or at least start going in that direction, and likewise, concentric ring going from there. So we're really looking at the downtown and the Carousel Mall site as catalyst for the entire city. And so then we'll be able to, we could always change. We could do general plan amendments. In the future, we don't have to wait 20 years to do our next general plan. We could do incrementally change it, over various cycles, if you will. We do the housing elements every 8 years, but we could, it's always going to be a fluid process, and like Mark was indicating, we do annual reports to report how did we do last year, right? And then that's when we start to hold ourselves accountable. It's like, okay, what else can we do? Well, do we have to change the zoning standards? Do we have to change land use classifications? What do we need to do to make it, frankly, easier for housing to come in? That's really our goal. And we'll learn along the process, along time. It's like, well, okay, those knuckleheads back in 2022, they thought this, but now things changed. There's a lot of things that changed. I mean, the world was different 10, 20 years ago. And so there's a lot of factors that go into.
And one other thing to mention too, I think, you see the maps and they can be discouraging at times, but, as Oliver had mentioned, you've got the Carousel Mall project, and you can just look as far as what's happening with Waterman Gardens. I mean, literally just reclaiming that area block by block, and making dramatic, significant improvements. So when you think of things like that, you got Waterman Gardens, you've got the Carousel Mall, you've got the Downtown Specific Plan. It's just reclaiming those areas one by one with the tools that you have in place. And it may not be, you may not get to everything. You probably will not get to everything, but it's what you can do, just step by step.
Do we have any other comments from the audience? State your name, please.
Hello, James Albert, Ward 7. In terms of the questions that are on the screen that come to mind are, one, with fair housing, there's certainly been a lack of enforcement since fair housing was adopted back in the 60s that I see, and just wondering how local communities can bridge that gap in terms of those enforcement mechanisms. The other part is habitability, which I didn't see mentioned in the components of fair housing. I think it's very important that we make sure that we're meeting the needs of affordable housing, but also keeping in mind that there's a lot of those units here in our city that exist today that are just simply not habitable for those that are living it, whether it be overcrowding or other reasons. The third thing I want to raise is that as we're building more transit-oriented communities, I want to make sure that those housing units around those transit-oriented communities are affordable to people, and people are not being displaced or gentrified. In essence, is what I've been seeing, or growing concerned about what's been happening in Redlands with their villages that have been building. There's no protection in place for affordability around those villages, and I would like to see that corrected here in San Bernardino. Thank you.
I just had a comment on Mr. Bell's question about a city that's turned things around. Fontana, for our area. When I came to San Bernardino in the early 80s, Fontana had Kaiser was closing down. That's where everybody worked. They were looking at a very dismal future. Plus they had all kinds of negatives. They had, the American Nazi Party had a march there one time. They had their own chapter of the Ku Klux Klan at the time. Hells Angels. There were interesting long stories, and we won't get into that. Where TV programs pictured Fontana as kind of a biker bar. Not very gentle. But Fontana got deeply into debt. And I'm not quite sure if Fontana is still the most deeply indebted per capita city in California, but it was at one time. But they spent a lot of money. It was through redevelopment. And of course, redevelopment is no longer available. So that's one opportunity that they had that no longer exists. And also, too, they've got Kaiser, obviously having that big hospital that's been doubling and tripling in size. And you got all the physicians and nurses and so forth. Well, now they got the golf course. I can't remember, what's the name of the golf course in Fontana? In the north end, and a very, Sierra Lakes, and a housing development around that. That's not Fontana 40 years ago.
I wanted to bring up on this thing that you have for regional housing needs allocation, apartments, low, moderate income, higher density. And to me, I seem to have the feeling that it's unlikely whole families, because a lot of low-income people are not single. They have families, children, and then they don't have the space for the children to run around. And I guess it's going to be done by your income. Nobody can make those people choose or not to choose to move on there. But if a lot of the apartments that are made in higher density areas for low to moderate income people, families included, I can't see them squashed into a family unit, an apartment unit, if they have more than 3 children.
The reason why the chart was put together also is it doesn't mean that you can't build housing or subsidize housing or subsidize home ownership for low-income families. And frankly, you do have a program. I think it's just recently Mary Erickson and MPHS has a home ownership program where they're working with the city to get to have some of the infill lots and have homes being built on those lots. The reason why we include it in this fashion is that what the state does is it says that if we have a density category that's upwards of 30 units per acre, we can count that site as fulfilling the RENA for low income. That's how they see it. It doesn't mean that we can't adopt other strategies. It just means that having apartments and higher density will allow us to meet those RENA credits. So you could still go through and have single-family homes that are through your neighborhood stabilization program, or ones that you rehabilitate and you sell for, to low-income households. All of that still counts as well. It's just that you kind of need the other thing, which is the density. So, but I think what you're speaking to is you really need a broader strategy, because most apartments, there's nothing that's built that's 4 and 5 bedrooms. So it's not going to work for large families, and it's not going to work for multi-generational families. It works for a certain segment.
Yeah, it works for certain segments. Because now you see families in the units that were apartments in the old days that were built for certain sections, and you have a bicycle strapped to the railing, and you have all toys outside the window, and you just can't accommodate them, but they have no other place to go to.
I think the other thing what this comes down to is also the quality of the products that are built. And, in your development code, when an area is allowed for multiple family, and particularly for, apartments, it's making sure that the apartments are built with, to the extent they can, with the appropriate amenities and design. We can all point to the apartments that were built in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and they're not suitable for families. There's no way they're suitable. They're just blocks, concrete blocks. And so, I always encourage that if a family apartment is going to be built, that the codes and that the development codes be stringent and require the types of amenities, the types of parking, the types of recreation that's really conducive to family living. It has to be done. So, there are certain types of apartments which you may not have to have all those amenities, maybe for singles or some of the high density, products downtown, but for family housing, it really has to be done right.
If I can just make a comment on that. So I think where we as a committee can really help out here is that I don't think we're going to be particularly effective in regulating a particular unit or particular construction, but what we should really be focusing on is the area. In other words, access to services and access to transportation and access to green space in every livable area. So how do we bring all of these elements together so that it enables us to build the higher density, lower income, single family, bring it all together so that everybody has these neighborhood communities where they can thrive, where they have all the services they need without having to, go from whatever. So, we can't look at it as a single project by project. What we need to do is look at ways that we can incentivize neighborhood development. In other words, we can build, for every, I'm going to make up a number here, for every 250 apartment units, there needs to be a grocery. There needs to be this type of service. There needs to be a transportation hub within, 600 yards. Whatever the numbers are, I think that's where we can come in and help shape those policies.
Well put.
Does Waterman Gardens, does that way it's structured and financially, does that give us credit? Is that full credit?
Yes, it is. It is if the apartment is built for this housing element cycle, if it's built after July 1st of 2021, the city receives 100% RENA credit.
And even though it's taking, unfortunately, a long period of time to get this fully developed, but it still counts, though.
Well, the portion that's built after 2021 counts toward this housing element period. Now, the portion that was built before that, there was portions that were built in 2016 and 2017. That counts toward the last housing element cycle. But for this one, for this 8 years, whatever's built in this 8 years counts. Does that make sense? We can't take, the state law would not allow the city to take credit for something that was built years ago. It has to be built like in the next 8 years.
Correct, yeah. And because this project is taking, I think, longer than most people anticipated. So that was just kind of my question on that.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
guess we can move on then. Thank you so much. Are there any reports or announcements from the General Plan Advisory Committee? If not, then the director's report.
Yes, as Woody had indicated last night, the city council approved the vision statements for the general plan and for the downtown specific plan. So that was great news, and so we'll still continue to plow forward. Wanted to announce also that at the next meeting, the April 6th, we will be presenting an amendment to the contract so that we could expand or enhance the public participation component of those two exercises. And so that report will be going out the Thursday before. So if you want to look online and see what that new program is, or maybe I could we'll just email it to you because it came out of this group anyway from your recommendations. But it is very robust, has a lot of different avenues and recommendations. It's added additional workshops, for the next phases over the course of the next several months. But just kind of wanted to alert you that is coming up at the April 6th meeting. And that's it for me. Thank you. And I think we wanted to see the video. Is that what we?
Are you ready?
Let's do it. This is
So our next meeting,
no our city council meeting.
You have high tech here.
I don't think there's sound. Oh, yeah? Yeah, on the computer, because it would normally come out of the speakers. Why you gotta pause it right there?
nice flattering pose.
Yeah.
Whoa, let me take a picture of that on my phone.
No. Let's just put that back.
You would have got a lot of hits on that one.
Nah.
it's not even being powered up by the computer. Wait a minute.
That is an AD guy in junior high school, right? Only person in the whole school that knows how to do the projector. Remember that? We're the only one guy that knows how to do the film, right? Film projector.
But it might be.
Okay, are we ready? We have sound.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stephanie with Community and Economic Development. Are you interested in housing for all residents, businesses that serve community needs, safe parks, or the overall quality of life for you and your neighbors? If so, now's the time to get involved. San Bernardino 2050 is a major planning initiative led by the City of San Bernardino that involves an update to the general plan. The general plan is a long-range plan that sets goals and policies for how San Bernardino will look in the year 2050. We will be hosting a series of upcoming workshops in each ward. These workshops will be held on different days where you can help us identify areas in which new housing, businesses, industries, parks and open spaces, and other uses should be located. Now's the time to make your voice heard, and it's an opportunity for you to change the future of your city. I'm Stephanie Sanchez, encouraging you to visit futuresc2050.com and learn how you can participate. Would you also like to see the Spanish version?
You speaking Spanish?
No, Harold.
Okay.
So we do have a Spanish version if you'd like to see that as well.
I think so.
Okay.
I would like to see that.
I don't know if it's still going there.
Hola, soy Harold Luna de la División de Planificación de la Ciudad de San Bernardino. ¿Está interesado en viviendas para todos los residentes, empresas que atiendan las necesidades de la comunidad, parques seguros o mejorar la calidad de vida general para usted y sus vecinos? Si es así, ahora es el momento de involucrarse. San Bernardino 2050 es una importante iniciativa de planificación liderada por la ciudad de San Bernardino que implica una actualización del Plan General. El Plan General es un plan a largo plazo que establece metas y políticas sobre cómo se verá San Bernardino en el año 2050. Nosotros estaremos organizando una serie de próximos talleres en su vecindario. En estos talleres puedes ayudarnos y identificar las zonas en las que viviendas nuevas, negocios, industrias, parques y espacios abiertos y otros usos deben ubicarse. Otra vez, soy Harold Luna con la División de Planificación de la Ciudad de San Bernardino. Ahora es el momento de hacer oír tu voz. Esta es una oportunidad para darle forma al futuro de su ciudad. Visite futuresb2050.com para obtener más información sobre cómo participar. Gracias.
Well, if there is no other business before the board, I entertain a motion to adjourn in a second.
A second.
I made the motion, I guess. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are we meeting again on April 14th?
No.
No, May.
The next meeting will be May
Third Thursday?
May 19th.
May 19th is a definite.
May 19th. Okay.
Right.
Adjourn.